All right, so we're taking a deep dive today into the world of U.S. nonprofits.
Specifically 501c3 organizations.
Yeah, the ones everyone always hears about.
Those tax-exempt organizations.
Right, and it can get really complicated. So we've pulled a bunch of sources,
IRS publications.
legal guides,
All the good stuff.
to give you like a cheat sheet
Exactly.
to this whole world of nonprofit.
To this unique corner of the nonprofit world.
And what we're really trying to do today is extract the most important and useful information.
The stuff that people really need to know.
Yeah, the stuff that maybe you wouldn't just find in like a basic overview. Think of this like your,
Backstage pass.
yeah, it's a 501c3.
The inner workings.
Okay, so one of the first things that jumped out at me in these sources
Yeah?
was this thing called the NTE code.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
That's how the IRS categorizes nonprofits.
Oh, so it's kind of like
Like a Dewey Decimal System
Yeah.
for all the good deeds out there.
but it's more than just...
It's more than just organizational, though. Oh, really?
Yeah, think about it. The NTE code can actually impact an organization's funding opportunities,
Oh, wow.
how the public perceives them,
Hmm.
and even how potential donors even find them.
So it's really like their identity
Yeah, you could say that.
in the nonprofit world.
And here's a fun fact.
Okay.
If a nonprofit wants to change their NTE code,
Uh-huh.
they have to formally request it from the IRS.
Oh, my gosh.
Talk about bureaucratic hoops.
Really? So, like, even if they decide they don't like their code,
Yes.
they can't just change it?
Nope.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Gotta love the IRS.
Reminds me of that time I tried to change my address at the DMV.
Oh, yeah.
A whole other story.
We'll save that for another time.
Okay, so NT codes, we get it.
That's one down.
The sources also mention this term, instrumentality.
Ah, yes.
And I was like, what is this? Some kind of sci-fi gadget?
Not quite science fiction,
Okay.
but it's really interesting.
Tell me more.
So essentially it has to do with how certain organizations function within the government.
Like, for example, let's take your local hospital. Now, for that hospital to be a 501c3, it has to operate independently from the government.
So even if it's like a public hospital funded by the city,
Exactly.
it can't be directly controlled by the government.
There needs to be a real separation there.
Okay, so there are rules,
There are rules.
even for these public institutions.
It's called the integral part test.
Okay.
And
Oh.
think about it this way. Imagine if your local public school
Yeah.
was run like a private foundation.
Ooh, that would be interesting.
Right, with its own set of rules and funding sources.
Oh, that's a good point.
It could get complicated.
Speaking of foundations, I noticed the sources make a distinction between private operating and non-operating foundations.
Oh, yeah.
What is that about?
So a private operating foundation,
Uh-huh.
they actually directly run their own charitable programs.
Okay.
You know, things like research institutes or museums.
So they're really hands-on.
Exactly. Whereas non-operating foundations, they are more like grant makers.
So they're funding other people.
They are giving money to other nonprofits to do the work.
I see. So it's really all about how directly,
How directly they're involved.
they're involved in the charitable work.
Right.
So is there any strategic reason
Well, yeah.
to choose one over the other?
Choosing to be an operating foundation can be very strategic,
Okay.
even though they have to spend a larger portion of their assets each year.
Why would they choose that then?
Well, one key reason
Yeah.
is the potential tax benefits for their donors.
Oh, tell me more.
Donors might get a larger tax deduction for gifts made to operating foundations.
Interesting.
So it can incentivize giving.
So there's a financial incentive
There can be.
for people to donate
Mm-hmm.
to those operating foundations.
Yeah,
Okay, so we've got these different types of 501c3,
right.
each with their own quirks and rules,
Uh-huh.
but I'm assuming they all have to play by the same rules when it comes to lobbying.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the IRS doesn't mess around when it comes to lobbying.
I bet they don't.
They have a very specific definition.
Okay, tell me.
It's actually broader than you might think.
Really?
It includes anything that tries to sway legislation, whether it's direct talks with lawmakers
Okay.
or influencing public opinion.
So even something like a social media campaign
Exactly.
could be considered lobbying,
It could be,
depending on the content.
depending on the intent.
Wow. So there are a lot of rules around this.
There are.
So I'm assuming there are limits to how much these organizations can actually lobby.
You are correct.
Okay, so what are those limits?
Well, it depends.
On what?
It depends on the type of organization and their overall spending.
Okay.
But here's where it gets interesting.
Okay.
Public charities have this really interesting option.
Oh, tell me.
They can choose to have their lobbying measured based on how much they spend.
So not just like whether they're doing it a lot.
Exactly.
Oh, that's interesting.
It gives them a little more flexibility.
So are there any strategic implications for public charities? Like, why wouldn't everyone choose this?
Well, there are definitely trade-offs to consider.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, this option might make more sense for an organization that's very involved in advocacy work,
Right.
but it could also raise questions from donors who want to ensure their money is going directly to programs.
So it's a balancing act.
It is.
So even if I donate to a nonprofit that's doing a lot of lobbying under this expenditure test,
Yeah.
I still get my tax deduction.
As long as the organization stays within those spending limits,
Okay.
you're good to go.
Got it.
However,
So,
it gets a little more complicated
how so?
when you factor in affiliated organizations.
What do you mean?
It's like their lobbying power combined.
So if there are like multiple 501c3s working together,
Exactly.
the lobbying limit applies to the entire group.
To the entire group,
Wow.
not just each individual member.
So if one group goes overboard,
hmm
it affects everyone.
Everyone's tax-exempt status is at risk.
That's pretty high stakes.
It is.
So besides overdoing it on lobbying,
Yeah.
are there any other ways a 501c3 could lose its status?
Oh, absolutely.
Like what?
Failing to file their annual Form 990s
Uh-huh.
for 3 years straight,
Really?
that's an automatic revocation.
Oh my gosh.
Poof, no more tax-exempt status.
So those deadlines.
Deadlines are serious business.
I'm sensing a theme here.
The IRS means business.
The IRS means business.
Don't mess with them.
What's this timely mailing rule I saw mentioned?
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Does that give them some wiggle room?
In a way,
Okay.
if an organization mails their Form 990 by the deadline,
Mhm.
it's considered filed on time,
Okay.
even if it arrives at the IRS later.
Oh, that's good to know.
But the catch is they
Yeah.
need proof of mailing.
Oh, so like a certified mail receipt.
Exactly.
So it's all about,
Dotting your I's and crossing your T's.
okay, don't mess with the IRS and their deadlines.
Nope.
Noted.
Don't.
Okay, let's shift gears to something a little less intimidating.
Okay, I'm ready.
School fundraising.
Ah, yes.
Seems pretty straightforward, right?
You would think so.
But I'm guessing there are some complexities.
Oh, there always are.
Right.
Especially when donors get something in return for their donation.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The IRS has rules about that.
Oh, really? What are they?
They say donors can only deduct the amount of their donation
Uh-huh.
that exceeds the fair market value of what they get in return.
Okay, so give me an example.
Imagine attending a school's charity gala,
Okay.
and the ticket price is $100,
Uh-huh.
but the dinner itself is only worth $80.
Okay.
So the school needs to be very clear with people about how much of that ticket price is actually tax deductible.
So they can only write off $20.
Exactly.
Wow, that's important.
It is.
So it's not just assumed that the entire donation
Right.
is
Yeah.
deductible.
They have to be transparent.
Speaking of transparency, the sources also delve into this whole situation with life insurance policies
Oh, yes.
and charitable remainder trusts.
A classic combination.
Right. It sounds complicated.
Well, imagine someone sets up a charitable remainder trust.
Okay, like a timed treasure check.
Right. They receive income from it for a while, and then after a set time,
Yep.
the rest of the money goes to a charity.
Gotcha.
Now, let's say that trust owns a life insurance policy.
Okay.
If the charity isn't directly named as the beneficiary,
Yeah.
the IRS starts asking questions.
Real?
They want to make sure it's not a way to dodge estate taxes
Oh, I saw.
or give an unfair advantage to a non-charitable beneficiary.
So it's all about making sure,
That the money goes to the right place.
yeah, the charitable intent is genuine.
Exactly.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit.
Sure.
Talk about private schools.
Always a hot topic.
Right. Everyone has an opinion,
Uh-huh.
but the IRS has rules.
Of course they do.
So what are they?
They're required to have a racially non-discriminatory policy. And this applies to every single aspect of their operation.
Wow.
And it's not enough to just have it.
Oh, really?
They have to put it in writing,
Uh-huh.
make it publicly known,
Wow.
and recertify it annually. So every year under penalty of perjury.
Wow, they're serious about this.
They are.
And this applies to
Everything,
admissions, scholarships, facilities, everything.
every single thing.
Wow, the IRS is really hammering this point home.
They want to see that these schools are committed to inclusion
Makes sense.
and equity.
Okay, last big question before we move on.
Hit me.
What exactly makes a private foundation private?
That's a good question.
Because I'm assuming the name's a bit of a giveaway.
Right, but it's more nuanced than that.
Okay, tell me more.
Essentially, a private foundation is private because it doesn't meet the criteria of the other categories.
So it doesn't get support from the public.
Exactly.
That way.
If an organization doesn't check those boxes, it's assumed to be private by default.
That's like a catch-all category.
You could say that.
And private foundations have a different set of rules.
Oh, yes.
Like what?
Stricter regulations, limitations on lobbying, different tax implications for donors.
It's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah.
So choosing between public charity status and private foundation status is a big decision for an organization.
It impacts everything.
We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
But I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
There's always more to learn.
Of this 501c3 world.
It's a fascinating world.
It is.
Full of complexity.
We'll dive back in after a short break.
Sounds good to me.
Don't go anywhere.
We'll be right back.
Okay, we're back and ready to keep going with our 501c3 deep dive.
It's a deep one.
Before the break, we were talking about some of the more
nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, of these organizations.
The stuff people don't always think about.
Right, from instrumentality
to lobbying limits.
And I want to get into this concept of public support now.
Ah, yes, a crucial concept.
Because I'm guessing the IRS has a very specific definition of what qualifies.
Oh, you bet they do.
So what is it? What do they consider public support?
It's not just about having a popular Instagram account.
Okay, good to know.
They really look at where an organization's funding comes from, how their governing board is set up.
So like who's on the board?
Exactly.
Right.
And whether their activities actually benefit a broad slice of the public.
So it's not just serving a small group of people.
Exactly. It's about genuine community support.
Not just relying on like a small circle of insiders.
Right. And that's where these tests come in.
Tests.
Yeah. One is called the 1/3 support test.
Okay. What's that all about?
Well, essentially, at least 1/3 of an organization's support has to come from a mix of different sources.
Like what?
Things like government grants,
contributions
from the general public,
right,
and indirect contributions from other public charities.
So like organizations like the United Way.
Exactly. They act as a conduit. Okay.
For public support.
So if an organization can show they've got this diverse base of support,
right,
they're more likely to pass this test.
And be considered a public charity.
Which I'm assuming comes with certain advantages.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's not the only test.
Nope. There's another one.
What's that one called?
It's called the Facts and Circumstances Test.
Okay, so that's a little more...
It's a little more subjective.
Yeah.
The IRS takes a broader view.
So what kind of facts and circumstances are we talking about?
Well, they look at the organization's history of fundraising.
Okay.
How they engage with the community, who's on their governing board.
So it's a more holistic picture.
Exactly. It's not just about a snapshot in time.
Okay.
It's about showing a commitment to engaging the public.
Gotcha.
And speaking of unique situations, the sources bring up this interesting concept of an unusual grant.
Unusual grant? What is that?
So imagine a small grassroots organization suddenly gets a huge, unexpected donation.
Maybe from a tech billionaire or something?
Oh, wow.
That could throw off their support ratios.
Yeah, I could see that.
And make them look less publicly supported.
Than they really are.
Exactly.
So how does the IRS handle these outlier situations?
Well, they have criteria for deciding if a grant is unusual enough.
To be excluded.
To be excluded from those calculations.
So what are the criteria?
Well, for example, it can't come from someone who founded the organization or a major contributor. And it can't come with strings attached.
So no funny business.
Nope. The IRS wants to see that it's a genuine gift.
So these big one-time gifts don't distort the overall picture.
Exactly. They recognize that sometimes these outlier contributions don't really reflect an organization's typical fundraising patterns.
Makes sense. So do you have any examples that illustrate how these public support tests actually play out in the real world?
Oh, of course.
Okay, I'm ready.
Let's take a symphony orchestra that relies on a combination of individual contributions and funding from a community chest.
So like a local United Way.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, because they can show they're getting funding from wide range of sources. Including small donations from everyday people. They pass the 1/3 support test.
So they're truly rooted
in community.
In their community.
Which is a good contrast to some of those organizations that rely on a handful of wealthy donors.
Right. Okay, so that's one example.
What about a philanthropic organization set up by a wealthy family? They mostly give grants to other charities and rely heavily on investment income from their endowment.
So they have a pretty solid financial foundation.
They do, but Since they were started by a small group of donors, and their board is mainly family members, they're classified as a private foundation.
Oh, so even though they're doing charitable work, the way they're structured,
and where their funding comes from,
determines their classification.
Exactly. It highlights those core structural elements.
Okay, so let's talk about supporting organizations.
Oh, yes, the charitable sidekicks.
Right. They exist solely to support other public charities.
You got it.
So tell me about them.
Well, there are actually 3 types.
3 types.
Type I, Type 2, and Type 3.
Okay, and each type has its own set of rules?
Absolutely.
Okay, break it down for me.
So, Type I supporting organizations, they're essentially controlled by the public charity they support.
So it's a close relationship.
Very close, almost like a parent-child dynamic.
Okay.
Now, Type 2 supporting organizations, they're a bit more independent, but they still have a strong connection
to the organization they support.
Right. Usually the majority of their board members are the same people.
Oh, that makes sense.
So they have their own legal identity.
Yeah.
But they're still working closely together.
Okay, what about Type 3?
Type 3 supporting organizations are the most independent.
Okay.
They don't have to be controlled by or share board members with the public charity they support.
So how do they prove they're legitimate then?
They have to pass something called the integral part test.
What's that?
They need to show that their activities are closely tied to and crucial for the supported organization's mission.
So their work is really important for the supported organization.
And there are 2 ways they can pass this test.
2 ways?
They can be functionally integrated.
Meaning?
Their work is practically an extension of the supported organization. Or they can be non-functionally integrated.
Okay.
Meaning they operate more independently, but still make significant contributions.
So it's a spectrum
of independence.
Even within this category.
Exactly.
Of supporting organizations.
There's a lot of flexibility.
It's fascinating to see how many different ways nonprofits can structure themselves.
It is.
To achieve their goals.
It's all about finding the right fit.
So we've talked about supporting organizations for public charities.
Right.
What about private foundations? Can they have supporting organizations too?
They can.
Okay.
But there are some important caveats.
Like what?
Well, remember, private foundations are under a stricter set of rules compared to public charities.
Right.
And those rules carry over to their supporting organizations.
Makes sense.
So what are some of those special rules?
Yeah, tell me.
Well, first off, the supporting organization can't be controlled by what the IRS calls disqualified persons.
Disqualified persons, who are they?
That's a broad term.
Okay.
It includes major contributors to the foundation, foundation managers, and certain family members.
So it's all about preventing conflicts of interest.
Exactly.
And making sure that those private foundation dollars are being used properly.
The IRS wants to see that charitable funds are going towards public benefit.
Not just benefiting private interests.
Exactly.
Okay, so speaking of private interests, the sources mention this thing called the attribution rule.
Ah, yes, the attribution rule.
What's that all about?
Well, it's basically a way for the IRS to keep tabs on private foundations and prevent them from using supporting organizations to get around those stricter rules.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
So basically, if a supporting organization gets funding from a private foundation, that funding is treated as if it came directly from the foundation.
When it comes to those public support tests.
You got it.
So if a private foundation tries to funnel money to a supporting organization that doesn't actually meet the requirements of a public charity.
The IRS can see right through that.
They're not fooling anyone.
Nope, they're going to look through that supporting organization and treat it as if the foundation was making a direct grant to another private foundation.
Which has tax implications.
Oh,
so it's like a check and balance system.
Exactly.
To make sure everything is above board.
The IRS is always watching.
So we've talked about public support tests, different types of supporting organizations.
And even the attribution rule.
It's amazing how much complexity there is within this 501c3 world.
It's a world unto itself.
With its own language and rules.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's fascinating.
It is.
Now, we have one more big topic to cover before we wrap up.
What's that?
Lobbying.
Ah, yes, lobbying.
We touched on it briefly earlier.
We did.
But I think we need to unpack it a bit more.
I agree. It's a complex area.
So as a refresher, what exactly does the IRS consider lobbying?
Well, remember, they define it broadly as any attempt to influence legislation.
Okay.
That includes direct lobbying,
Like what?
Communicating directly with lawmakers
Okay.
or their staff, and grassroots lobbying.
Which is more about swaying public opinion.
Exactly.
So if I write a letter to my senator urging them to support a particular bill.
That's considered lobbying.
And if I launch a social media campaign encouraging people to contact their representatives.
Also lobbying.
Okay, so it's a pretty broad definition.
It is.
Now, I'm assuming there are limits.
There are.
To how much these organizations can actually lobby.
Yes, and those limits are different for public charities and private foundations.
Okay, so break it down for me. What are the rules for each type?
For public charities, there are two main options.
Okay.
They can either have their lobbying activities measured by the substantial part test.
Okay.
Or they can choose to use the expenditure test.
Two tests. Tell me more about them. How are they different?
The substantial part test is like the default setting for public charities that haven't specifically chosen another option. It's a bit fuzzy, but it basically means an organization's lobbying efforts can't be a substantial part of what they do overall.
So if an organization is spending most of its time and resources on lobbying,
that's going to raise some red flags.
Yeah, I bet.
Now, the expenditure test is an alternative that public charities can choose if they want more concrete guidelines.
So what does it do?
It sets limits on how much money they can spend on lobbying.
Okay.
And those limits are based on their overall exempt purpose expenditures.
Exempt purpose expenditures? What's that?
Basically all the money they spend on actually carrying out their mission.
Okay, so if an organization has higher exempt purpose expenditures, they have more leeway to engage in lobbying.
That's the idea. The expenditure test allows them to spend a certain percentage of their exempt purpose expenditures on lobbying.
Without getting in trouble.
Without getting in trouble with the IRS.
So the bigger the organization, the more they can potentially spend.
Generally speaking, yes.
On lobbying.
The specific percentages are in the IRS regulations.
Okay.
But it wouldn't be fair to subject a tiny grassroots organization to the same lobbying limits as a huge national charity, right?
Right. It seems like the IRS is trying to be somewhat proportional here.
They are trying to create a level playing field.
So these lobbying rules only apply to public charities.
Right.
What about private foundations?
Private foundations are subject to much stricter limitations.
How so?
They're basically prohibited from engaging in A&Y lobbying activities.
Wow, so they can't lobby at all?
Nope. Full stop.
That's a pretty hard line.
It is. The IRS's view is that private foundations are essentially vehicles for private wealth.
Okay.
So they shouldn't be using their resources to try to influence legislation.
So if I'm really passionate about a cause that involves lobbying, it sounds like I should donate to a public charity.
That's generally good advice.
Rather than a private foundation.
Of course, there are always exceptions and nuances to these rules.
Of course.
So if you have specific questions about donating and lobbying,
Yeah.
it's always best to consult with a tax professional.
Always good to get expert advice.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
When it comes to lobbying.
All of information.
But before we move on, I want to touch on one more thing.
Okay.
This concept of affiliated organizations.
Ah, yes. We talked about that earlier. Right.
With lobbying limits.
And this is where things can get really tricky.
It can.
Because remember how the IRS looks at the lobbying activities of an entire group?
Of affiliated organizations?
When determining if they've gone over the limits.
Exactly.
So what are the implications of that?
Well, the flip side is that if one organization in the group goes overboard on lobbying, it can put the tax-exempt status of all the other organizations at risk.
So even if I donate to a charity,
Yeah.
that doesn't do any lobbying itself.
Right.
I could still be indirectly supporting lobbying activities.
If that charity is part of a larger affiliated group.
Or other members are engaging in lobbying.
Exactly. It's something donors need to be aware of.
So you really need to look beyond the surface.
Absolutely.
And understand the relationships and connections within the nonprofit world.
Sometimes the devil's in the detail.
Okay, so before we wrap up this segment, I want to quickly recap some of the key takeaways.
Sounds good.
From our lobbying discussion.
A little review never hurts. First, we learned that the IRS has a very broad definition of lobbying.
Right. Anything that aims to influence legislation.
Whether it's direct or through public opinion.
Exactly.
Second, we learned that public charities have two options for how their lobbying activities are measured.
The substantial part test.
And the expenditure test.
Correct.
Third, we learned that private foundations, unlike public charities, are pretty much banned from engaging in any lobbying whatsoever.
Well, stop.
And finally, we revisited the concept of affiliated organizations.
Right.
and how the IRS considers their combined lobbying activities.
Which can have big implications.
For everyone in the group.
For everyone involved.
Okay, that was a lot to process.
It was a lot.
But I feel like I'm getting a much clearer understanding now
Good.
of how lobbying works in this 501c3 world.
I'm glad to hear that it's definitely an area where a deeper dive is necessary.
Absolutely.
Fully grasp those nuances.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
All right, we're back for the final part of our 501c3 deep dive.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have from public support tests to supporting organizations to lobbying limits.
There's a lot to take in.
It is, but I feel like there are still a few hidden gems in these sources.
Oh, there are always more details to uncover.
Right, that we need to talk about.
These sources really get into the weeds.
I'm ready for those weeds.
Yeah.
Give me an example.
Okay, well, one thing that stood out to me was a section on fundraising events.
Okay.
Where donors get something in return.
Like a gift or something.
Exactly. It seems simple on the surface.
Right.
But there are some interesting nuances.
Okay, I'm listening.
Let's say you donate $100 to a charity for a ticket to a gala dinner.
Okay. Seems pretty straightforward.
Right. But the IRS wants to know how much of that $100 is a genuine donation.
Okay.
And how much is just the fair market value of the dinner itself.
Oh, so you have to separate the charitable part from the cost of admission.
Exactly. And it's up to the nonprofit to figure that out.
And tell the donor.
And tell the donor up front how much they can actually deduct.
So transparency is key.
Absolutely. Donors need to know where their money's going.
Now, another interesting scenario I saw
Oh, yeah.
involves those charitable remainder trusts that we talked about earlier.
The timed treasure chest.
Right, where they pay income to a beneficiary for a certain period, and then the remaining assets go to charity.
Exactly. But what about them? Well, the interesting part is that if the charity isn't directly named as the beneficiary of a life insurance policy held by the trust, but instead receives the proceeds indirectly, the IRS takes a closer look.
Why is that? What are they worried about?
They want to make sure this arrangement isn't being used to avoid estate taxes.
Oh, I see.
Or give an unfair advantage to the non-charitable beneficiary.
So it's all about protecting
the intended charitable purpose.
Okay, that makes sense.
The IRS is always looking out for those loopholes.
It seems like they're always one step ahead.
They try to be.
Okay, let's switch gears for a second and talk about private schools again.
Okay.
We know they can be 501c3 organizations. Right. But I remember the sources highlighted a specific requirement.
Oh, yes, a very important one.
That people often overlook. What is it?
Private schools are required to have a racially non-discriminatory policy.
Okay.
And this policy has to cover every single aspect of their operation.
Wow. That's pretty comprehensive.
It is, and they can't just have this policy.
What do you mean?
They have to put it in writing. Publicize it widely.
Wow.
And certified it every single year.
So every year they have to reaffirm this policy.
Under penalty of perjury.
Wow, they're not messing around.
The IRS is serious about this.
It sounds like it.
They want to ensure these schools are truly inclusive.
And this applies to
everything.
Admissions, scholarships, facilities, athletics.
The whole 9 yards.
Okay, so no exceptions.
No exceptions.
Now I want to circle back to something we talked about earlier.
Okay.
What exactly makes a private foundation private?
It's a good question, and the answer is actually pretty simple.
Okay, tell me.
A private foundation is private because it doesn't fit into any of the other categories.
So it doesn't qualify as a public charity
right.
or supporting organization.
Exactly. It's like the default setting.
For a 501c3.
Let's say that.
And private foundations have their own set of rules, right?
Oh, yes.
Like what?
Stricter regulations, limitations on lobbying, different tax implications for donors.
So it's really a different ballgame.
It is choosing between public charity status and private foundation status.
Is a big decision.
A huge decision.
For an organization.
It impacts everything.
Well, we've covered so much in this deep dive.
We have. It's been a journey.
I feel like my understanding of 501c3 organizations has grown exponentially.
I'm glad to hear that.
But before we go, I have to ask, what's the one big takeaway?
The one thing you want our listeners to remember?
Yes. If you had to distill it all down to one essential point, what would it be?
I would say the most important thing to remember is that understanding the nuances of 501c3 status is crucial.
For both nonprofits.
And donors.
So it's not enough to just have good intentions.
Right. You need to operate within the rules.
Be transparent about your activities.
And always prioritize the public benefit.
Well said. I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I agree.
And with that, we've reached the end of our 501c3 deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Me too. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the fascinating world of nonprofits.
Anytime.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope you found this deep dive informative and engaging.
And we'll see you next time.
For another deep dive into a different corner of the legal world.